The wind carried the scent of coal smoke before the train appeared. Then came the distant hum, a low, unnatural growl that grew into thunder. From the ridge above the tracks, a line of Cheyenne warriors lay still in the grass, watching the light approach through the darkness. Their faces were painted, their weapons quiet in hand. Below them the iron horse roared into view, black engine breathing steam, wheels shrieking on metal. And as you listen now, maybe you're far from that ridge and those rails. Perhaps in Kansas City, sipping your morning coffee before work, or in Los Angeles, watching headlights stretch across the freeway at night, or maybe in Berlin, lying in bed as the hum of a passing train fades outside your window. Wherever you are, this story reminds us that the clash between progress and tradition was never silent. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you'd like to keep uncovering the hidden battles that shaped this land, subscribe. It truly helps keep these histories alive. Now, back to the tracks. A war party crouched beside the bend where the rails had already been loosened. One man raised a torch. Another whispered a prayer to the spirits of the land. The ground trembled. The train rounded the bend at speed, unaware of what lay ahead. Then came the crash. Wood and steel twisted against the earth, followed by the scream of burning metal. Flames rose into the sky. Horses cried out. Rifles cracked once, then silence. Only fire remained. The warriors stood and watched. They had done what the elders warned would bring war, but war had already come. This was only a reply. Months earlier, the first signs had appeared across the northern plains. Wooden stakes driven into buffalo trails. Surveyors with books and iron markers, walking lands no white man had stepped on before. Then came the track layers. Dozens of men with axes, picks and shovels driving their straight path westward through grassland and hunting ground. The Cheyenne had never seen such a thing. Not a road, but a machine path, laid with steel and made for the iron horse. The name came from its breath, its noise, its speed. The locomotive hissed like a living beast, devouring land as it passed. With it came wagons, tents and soldiers. Telegraph wires followed, strung like webs over the old trails. The Cheyenne watched from afar. The buffalo herds grew thinner, dust rose where the rails stretched. Small fires sometimes broke out when coal sparks hit dry grass. The land was changing, quickly and not in their favour. At council fires the old ones spoke of treaties already broken. The young men listened with tightened jaws. They called the railroad a blade, and blades cut both ways. The railroad was not just a machine, it was a warning. Each mile of track pushed deeper into Cheyenne territory, and with it came workers, soldiers, and settlers. The open plains that once held endless buffalo were now being measured, fenced, and charted. Rail officials and army officers claimed it was progress. To the Cheyenne, it was invasion. Chiefs rode for counsel from distant bands. Bent Knee, Little Robe, and other elders spoke plainly. They had seen the treaties ignored, promises dissolved with every new camp that sprang up beside the rails. The younger warriors pressed for action. They scouted the work camps, marked the pace of construction, counted the guards. Meanwhile, steam engines rolled past them with impunity. The Cheyenne learned the schedule, when supply trains arrived, how long they stopped, and which sections of track remained unguarded. They also saw what the trains carried: boxes of rifles, sacks of flour, cattle and people. White expansion was not stopping. The iron horse was more than a threat to land. It was the spine of a larger movement that brought more settlers, more soldiers, and fewer options. Waiting longer would mean giving up ground that could never be reclaimed. The buffalo herds, once numbering in the tens of thousands, had begun to vanish. Hunting parties returned with fewer hides. Scouts rode further each month in search of game. Where buffalo once grazed, they now found fences and iron rails. The Cheyenne understood the link. With the railroad came market hunters. Men paid to shoot hundreds of buffalo per day, leaving the carcasses to rot in the sun. Bones were collected for fertilizer, hides sold for industry, and the meat often left untouched. It was slaughter without purpose. Without the buffalo, Cheyenne life could not continue. The animal provided food, shelter, clothing, tools. Its absence meant starvation. The iron horse did not just pass through their land. It changed everything in its path. Even the sacred spaces, rivers, burial grounds, traditional meeting places, were disturbed or destroyed. Children asked questions the elders could not answer. Why were the whites allowed to do this? Why had the spirits not stopped them? The Cheyenne held ceremonies for guidance, but the signs were clear. The time for words had passed. The young men made ready. Their horses were fast, their rifles loaded, and their plan was already taking shape. As night fell on the plains, the Cheyenne gathered in silence. Campfires were dimmed, voices kept low. Across the prairie, messages had been passed in the old ways. Carved sticks, smoke signals, runners moving between camps. Warriors from multiple bands now stood side by side. Each man carried what he needed: rifle, bow, hatchet, water, and sometimes a small pouch of tobacco or medicine. Their faces were painted with black and red, the colours of war. No chants were sung, no drums were beaten. This was not a celebration. It was a mission. Scouts had already checked the tracks near a bend in the line where trains often slowed. The ground there was soft, easy to dig, easy to sabotage. From a distance, the Iron Horse's whistle could be heard. It was on schedule. The plan was simple: weaken the rails, attack fast, and burn what could not be taken. There would be no negotiation, no warning. This was not about conquest or territory. It was about sending a message. The Cheyenne were not gone. They were watching, and they were willing to fight for the land that raised them, even if it meant striking steel with fire. The wreckage of the burned train did not stop the advance. Within days, another engine rolled across newly repaired tracks, flanked by soldiers with rifles and orders to shoot. The railroad company sent word to Washington, and the army responded. Camps were reinforced, schedules tightened, and construction resumed. For the Cheyenne, this was expected. What troubled them more was the silence from the treaty agents, the men who had once promised boundaries, rations, and peace. Those promises, made in council lodges and written on paper, had no weight now. In 1867 and 1868, the US government signed treaties like the Medicine Lodge Agreement, assuring the tribes of land and hunting rights. But within just a few years, those very lands were being crossed by telegraph lines and rails. The buffalo herds were still shrinking. Traders brought whiskey and sickness. Soldiers set up posts on treaty ground. The Cheyenne chief sent runners to the agencies demanding answers. Most received none. Others were told to wait. Meanwhile, white settlers increased. Families in covered wagons now followed the rail lines west, carving trails through what had once been tribal space. The land was being divided, but the Cheyenne had never agreed to its sale. Word of the betrayal spread quickly across the plains. Cheyenne bands met with Arapaho, Sioux, and Kiowa messengers to discuss the railroad's path and the army's growing presence. Campfires became councils. Elders spoke of old treaties and the long memory of broken words. Some argued for patience. Others, especially the younger warriors, called for coordinated strikes. They studied the enemy. The trains ran on strict schedules. The rail posts were lightly guarded at night, and the soldiers travelled in predictable formations. The Cheyenne were not unfamiliar with warfare. They had fought other tribes, Mexicans and American soldiers, before. What they faced now, however, was a force that did not stop, a machine backed by endless men and steel. Some suggested relocating further west, but there was no more untouched land. Others pointed to earlier attacks that had forced temporary halts in construction. Perhaps one sharp blow would delay the Iron Horse again. This time, not just a single band would act. Warriors from multiple camps began making quiet preparations. They cleaned rifles, checked horse tack, and watched the skies for signs. The decision was not made in haste, but it was made. The fire had to return to the tracks. The railroad continued to cut across the plains, but so did tension. In regions once considered safe, crews now moved with caution. Tracks were checked daily. Armed escorts rode ahead of supply wagons. Telegraph operators sent warnings between distant posts. Still, small raids increased. Telegraph poles were found chopped down. Ties and rails disappeared overnight. A water tower was burned without warning. Attributing each action to a specific tribe proved difficult, but military officers assumed Cheyenne involvement. In response, cavalry patrols expanded. Their presence did not prevent violence. In one instance, a detachment guarding a repair crew was ambushed before sunrise, resulting in several deaths. The soldiers were buried beside the tracks, their graves marked by crude wooden crosses. For the Cheyenne, these strikes were not random. They were planned messages, reminders that treaty violations had consequences. Tribal scouts moved constantly, studying rail patterns, noting troop numbers, and listening to gossip in trading posts. Young men practiced rifle drills in hidden valleys. Meanwhile, older warriors trained them in mounted strikes, how to fire, turn, and vanish before return fire could land. No major attack had yet been launched, but the pieces were moving. The Iron Horse was being watched from every direction. In one council lodge, deep in the shelter of a wooded ravine, the decision was finalized. The sky above was moonless, the air still. Warriors and elders sat close to the central fire, their shadows flickering against hide walls. A respected leader, not a chief, but known for his skill in battle, spoke with authority. He laid out the location, the timing, and the purpose. The train in question carried military supplies and had passed the same stretch of track 3 times each week. It travelled at night and slowed near a curve beside a shallow creek. The site had good cover, soft ground, and escape routes in multiple directions. Scouts had already watched it for 5 nights. The plan required no large force, just speed and coordination. The track would be weakened, the engine derailed, and the supplies either taken or burned. There would be no killing unless necessary. The message was more important than the bodies. When the council ended, no voices rose in disagreement. Each man understood what was at stake: land, dignity, survival. They left the lodge silently, walking into the dark without songs or farewells. By the next night they would be in position. The attack group moved in silence, riding under cover of stars. No fires were lit. Horses were walked, not ridden, until the group reached its chosen staging ground. The creek was quiet. The bend in the rail line was just as the scouts had described, isolated, with brush for concealment and a clear view of the horizon. Several warriors moved ahead, using short shovels and wooden wedges to work the earth beneath the rails. Others kept watch, crouched low with rifles drawn. They wore no feathers or decoration, only war paint and leather for stealth. A young scout returned from the west, confirming the train's distant light. The warriors spread out. Each knew his task: fire, rifle, hammer or signal. When the engine appeared, it came fast, its headlamp glowing like an eye in the dark. The first sparks of sabotage took effect. A sudden jolt, a grinding noise, and the engine leapt the tracks with a shriek. Cars slammed into one another, supplies scattered. Then came fire. Torches thrown, crates ignited. The crew tried to flee but were surrounded. No shots were fired unless met with resistance. Within minutes the Iron Horse burned again, casting orange light across the plain. The train left the nearest station shortly after dusk, its headlamp cutting a pale beam across the open prairie. The crew on board expected a routine run. Supplies to the next military post, a few passengers in the rear car, and no scheduled stops until morning. The locomotive was a Baldwin engine, typical for the time, with wood panel cars and iron fittings. Unknown to those aboard, the Cheyenne war party was already in position. Hidden in brush along a gentle curve in the track, they waited in absolute silence. Their scouts had confirmed the schedule earlier that day. A shallow creek crossed beneath the railbed, creating a natural choke point. The track had been carefully loosened with wedges and levered stones. Torches were ready but unlit. One man kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for the train's lamp. When it finally appeared, no one moved until the last moment. As the engine reached the weakened section, the rails gave way. The front wheels dropped, and the weight of the train pulled it sideways. Metal screamed. Cars buckled. Sparks lit the grass. In seconds, the Iron Horse was off the tracks, broken and vulnerable in the darkness. The Cheyenne warriors moved quickly. Torches were lit and thrown toward the broken cars. Flames took hold fast, catching crates of canvas, sacks of flour, and boxes of army tools. One car held spare rifles, which the warriors moved to seize before the fire spread. 2 soldiers stumbled from the wreckage and tried to raise weapons. One was shot before he could aim. The other dropped his rifle and ran into the dark. No pursuit followed. This was not a battle. It was a strike. Orders had been given. Fight only if attacked. Cheyenne warriors with long braids and painted faces moved through this chaos with discipline. They ignored anything not useful, burned what couldn't be carried. Horses whinnied in the distance but stayed tied. Smoke rose fast. Within minutes, the entire engine was engulfed. The sound of flames replaced the sound of rails. By the time the sky began to pale in the east, the attack was over. The warriors gathered in silence and began to ride out, leaving behind scorched rails, blackened wood, and shattered metal. It had taken less than 20 minutes. But in that time, a message had been delivered, clear, precise, and carved into iron. After the flames had taken hold, the Cheyenne made no effort to linger. They moved efficiently, gathering supplies they could carry: blankets, powder tins, cartridge boxes, and dry food. Several men lifted rifles from the damaged freight car, checking each quickly before handing them off. Ammunition crates were split open, and rounds were divided between saddlebags. Horses, tied in a drawer some distance away, were brought forward in silence. No one spoke above a whisper. The wounded train crew had been left alive, their weapons removed, but they were not harmed further. For the Cheyenne, the point had been made. The Iron Horse was not invincible. Warriors rode out in staggered pairs, following a narrow trail that avoided the main wagon routes. Scouts remained behind for 1 hour more, ensuring no immediate pursuit. The morning sun revealed only the aftermath: scorched soil, twisted rails, and the skeleton of a once powerful engine now collapsed into itself. Telegraph wires nearby had been cut earlier that day, preventing any quick call for help. It would be late afternoon before soldiers arrived. By then, the attackers were already gone, vanished into the hills and valleys that had sheltered them for generations. When the smoke from the destroyed train reached the nearest army post, the response was immediate. A mounted detachment of cavalry was dispatched before noon, armed and supplied for several days of pursuit. The officers knew this was not a random act. The attack was too precise, too coordinated. They had underestimated the planning ability of the Cheyenne. Reports were taken from the surviving train crew, who described men with war paint and deliberate movements. The commanding officer ordered patrols to spread out, targeting likely escape routes and nearby villages. Civilian workers were ordered to halt construction until the area was deemed secure. Telegraph lines, once repaired, buzzed with orders from higher command. By evening, soldiers had reached the burned wreck. They circled the site cautiously, rifles raised. What they found confirmed everything: a clean strike, executed with speed, minimal bloodshed, and maximum damage. The officers took note of the cut wires, the removed weapons, and the deliberate torching of cargo. Nothing had been left behind that could identify the attackers by name. But among the military men, there was little doubt. They knew who had done it, and they knew this would not be the last train to burn. News of the burned train spread quickly across the plains. Railroad companies called for stronger military escorts. Telegraph messages described the incident in plain terms: attack, sabotage, theft, destruction. Newspapers in frontier towns printed headlines about savage raids and the need for stronger enforcement. But within Cheyenne camps, the story was told differently. It was not spoken of with celebration or boasting. It was shared in quiet tones around campfires and over meals. Elders nodded. Warriors cleaned their weapons in silence. It had been necessary. A message to those who ignored treaties, destroyed buffalo, and carved tracks through sacred ground. The act was not seen as revenge. It was resistance. Other tribes heard the story and listened. In distant camps, Arapaho and Lakota scouts asked for details. What had worked? What the soldiers had done? How fast the fire had spread? The Cheyenne warriors who had been there gave answers only when asked. They had no desire for recognition. The Iron Horse had been struck, and that was enough. Whether it slowed the railroad or not was beyond their control, but for one night the land had answered back, and those who had seen it would not forget what fire could say. The military response was swift and unforgiving. Within 48 hours of the train's destruction, multiple cavalry detachments were in motion. Columns left from Fort Wallace, Fort Dodge, and smaller outposts along the Kansas Pacific line. Their orders were clear: locate the attackers, recover stolen property if possible, and punish those responsible. The plains became a theatre of movement. Soldiers rode in extended formations, dragging supply wagons behind them. Scouts, both white and native, were sent ahead to read tracks and estimate distances. Winter was approaching, and with it came harsher terrain, shorter days, and bitter winds. The army had underestimated the Cheyenne's mobility before, but not now. These expeditions were prepared for weeks in the field. They carried extra ammunition, hardtack, and medical kits. Officers held maps marked with tribal villages and assumed migration paths. In several locations, small Cheyenne camps were found and questioned. Families claimed no knowledge of the train attack. Some were detained, others fled. Skirmishes broke out near the Smoky Hill River and south toward the Arkansas. Each encounter left its mark: wounded horses, burned shelters, scattered belongings. but the warriors who had burned the Iron Horse had already disappeared into the folds of the prairie. As the soldiers pushed deeper into Cheyenne territory, they found the land less cooperative. Trails vanished in hard wind. Hoof prints were obscured by drifting snow. Streams froze at night and thawed unpredictably by day. The Cheyenne knew this terrain well. They used it to their advantage, circling back through arroyos and ridgelines, leaving false trails when needed. War parties split into smaller groups to confuse pursuers. Decoys were used. Some riders dismounted to lead horses through soft ground, masking their numbers. These tactics slowed the army's progress. At one point, a cavalry column followed a trail for 2 days before discovering it led to a decoy fire pit and nothing more. Frustration grew. Soldiers began taking supplies from civilian homesteads. Tensions rose within the ranks, but the Cheyenne kept moving. Their aim was not to fight open battles, but to survive and exhaust their enemy. They burned grass behind them. They emptied caches of food to prevent seizure. At one creek crossing, they left behind sharpened spikes buried just beneath the mud, a warning and a hazard. The land itself became part of the resistance, and for each day the army chased them, the Cheyenne slipped further out of reach. At night, the soldiers made camp in tight formation. Guards were posted in a wide perimeter with orders to shoot if movement was detected. Fires were kept small. The officers met in canvas tents lit by lanterns, reviewing maps and sending updates by courier, but their confidence was wearing thin. Rations were running low. Morale was uneven. Some soldiers spoke openly of turning back. Others, angered by the elusive enemy, pushed for harsher measures. In some cases, innocent Cheyenne families were caught in sweeps. Their lodges were torn down, food stores burned, and horses seized. The army justified these acts as necessary pressure. But for the Cheyenne, it was further proof that no distinction would be made between warrior and child. Stories spread quickly between camps. Elders began moving women and children deeper into isolated valleys or across river passes. Supply caches were buried, signal fires were banned, messengers were sent on foot to avoid detection. The warriors who had carried out the train attack remained hidden among scattered bands, never staying long in one place. They knew the patterns of the cavalry, the range of their scouts, and how long a horse could run before faltering, and they stayed ahead. By early winter, the pursuit had taken its toll. Snow now covered the plains in patches, and the wind carried ice. The soldiers' boots cracked from cold, and horses moved with heavy breath. Some men collapsed from exhaustion. Forage became scarce. Army supply lines were stretched thin. Several patrols were called back to posts near the rail lines, tasked with guarding work crews and preventing further sabotage. Meanwhile, Cheyenne families remained scattered and cautious. Villages no longer gathered in large encampments. They moved in smaller clusters, setting up and breaking down camps quickly. Elders spoke of older times, of long winters and migrations, and reminded the youth that survival was the first form of resistance. Game was harder to find, but caches of dried meat and hidden shelters sustained them. A few bands crossed into the territory of allied tribes for temporary refuge. The warriors continued scouting from a distance, keeping eyes on troop movements without engaging. The Iron Horse had brought the soldiers, but the land had slowed them, and now both sides waited, one to strike again when the chance appeared, the other to survive the cold long enough to resume the hunt come spring. When the spring thaw arrived, the cavalry returned with fresh orders and reinforcements. But by then the trail was gone. Tracks had vanished beneath new grass. Scorched ground from winter skirmishes had been overgrown. The Cheyenne had shifted location again. What began as a focused pursuit had become a wider campaign, stretching from Kansas into Colorado and the northern plains. Army officers filed reports noting lack of progress, low morale, and limited intelligence. Back in Washington, lawmakers debated the cost of continued conflict. Railroad companies pressed for more protection. Meanwhile, Cheyenne survivors prepared for another season of disruption. They knew the Iron Horse would return, and they knew more would come after it. But the fire they had started would not be easily forgotten. For the rest of that year, military trains carried heavier guards, track crews worked in larger units, telegraph lines were checked daily. The attack had forced a change, not a full stop but a delay. For the Cheyenne it was proof that steel could bleed, and for those who rode under the sun and stars across their ancestral lands, it was a reminder that the cost of resistance, though high, was not beyond paying. By the end of the decade, the railroad had pushed further west. Steel tracks now crossed lands once untouched. stretching through Colorado, Wyoming, and beyond. The Iron Horse moved faster than ever, heavier, louder, and more protected. Military escorts became a permanent feature on certain lines. Watchmen rode in supply cars. Telegraph stations doubled their staff. The memory of burned trains did not halt expansion, but it did leave a mark. Railroad companies filed risk reports. Army officers adjusted patrol routes. In Cheyenne country, the scars remained. Buried camps, abandoned trails, and the silence of lands that once echoed with hooves. The buffalo herds were nearly gone. Markets had taken what the rifles did not. Cheyenne villages now camped closer to agency lands, watched by soldiers and subject to ration deliveries. For many, the war had moved into a different form, less open, more controlled. But the memory of the night fire remained. It lived in the words of those who had seen it, and in the caution with which trains passed certain stretches of track. The Iron Horse survived, but so did the story of what happened when it was brought to a stop, and the flames reached higher than the smokestacks. In later years, the story of the burned train was passed down around fires, spoken in low voices after the day's work was done. It was not told with pride or boasting, but as a memory of action taken when all other paths had closed. Elders would describe the ground shaking as the engine approached, the silence before the crash, and the fire that followed. They named the warriors who rode that night, not as heroes, but as men who made a choice. In Cheyenne tradition, such stories were not just for remembrance, they were instruction. Young listeners were expected to hear what was said and understand what was not. The lesson was survival, dignity, resistance. Not all stories ended in victory, not all actions changed the world, but some, even brief ones, stood as lines drawn in the earth. Years later, when trains passed through without event, some Cheyenne would still look to the tracks and recall that time. A time when fire answered steel, when riders without cannon or government halted a machine, if only for a moment. And in that moment, they reminded the land, the enemy, and themselves that they had not disappeared. In government records, the incident was listed as train sabotage by hostile elements. The Army filed its reports, named suspected bands, and proposed increased presence along the route. Railroad companies requested federal assistance for security. Settler newspapers described the Cheyenne as obstacles to progress. But in the tribal record, spoken, remembered, and passed from one mouth to another, the event was something else. It was a line drawn, not in ink but in fire and broken steel. The Cheyenne did not record the attack in books or ledgers. It was carried in memory, attached to names, places, and smells. The sound of rails warping under heat, the taste of cold air before action, the feel of damp earth near the creek bend. Over time, fewer people remembered the exact details. The buffalo were gone, the trains became routine, the people were moved to reservations, but the moment remained embedded in the tribe's history. It reminded them that even in the face of overwhelming force, they had made themselves seen. Not as a footnote, but as a presence. As long as the story was told, even quietly, it lived. And in that way, the fire continued, burning not across tracks, but through time. Cheyenne oral historians, known for their precision, continued to pass the story through generations. Details remained consistent. The curve in the tracks, the time of night, the number of warriors, the sounds the engine made when it broke apart. Each element was recited with care, not as entertainment, but as responsibility. The young listened closely, because it was not just about the past. It was a reminder of the stakes when treaties are broken, when land is taken, and when identity is threatened. Ceremonies changed over the years, languages evolved, and new pressures emerged. But in winter lodges, during quiet nights, the old ones still spoke of the train that burned. Sometimes the story was told without names, so that the action mattered more than who carried it out. Sometimes it was told alongside others, of forced marches, of hiding from soldiers, of survival through blizzards. But this one always stood apart. It was a story not of escape or defeat, but of interruption. A brief moment when those being erased took control, even briefly, and though the tracks remained and the engines ran, the people who had once stopped it still remembered how. Today, little remains at the site of the attack. The railroad bend has long since been reinforced with steel and gravel. Trains pass it without slowing. Most passengers never know what happened there. There are no markers, no plaques, no visible scars. But for the descendants of those who lit the fires and watched the Iron Horse fall, the memory remains active. It is part of a larger story, one not written by expansionists or recorded in rail company documents, but carried in bloodlines and preserved in speech. Some families still visit the region in summer. They walk the ridges, ride horses near the old creek bed, and listen for the wind. They do not seek signs because they do not need them. The memory is already present, inherited, not imagined. And as long as those rides are taken, as long as the story is told correctly, the act itself endures. Not in defiance, but in continuity. The Iron Horse came. It carved its path across a nation. But on one night, in one place, it stopped. And in that pause, a people under pressure made themselves known, not through violence alone, but through the clarity of a single, unforgettable act. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time here. If you'd like to hear more quiet history like this, consider subscribing. Your support truly means a lot.